Hello everyone and welcome to our sixth episode of Embrace the Lockdown, a series that is designed to help us maximize our time in lockdown, particularly if we are on the search for God, if we're asking the big questions, if we're looking up to heaven at this time of great uncertainty and anxiety. In this episode, we're going to look at the importance of renewing our minds. Okay, the main topic for this episode and the next is going to be mental health. Mental health is something that has really come to the forefront of our attention, and not just globally but individually at this season of lockdown, as keeping mentally healthy is becoming increasingly challenging. And yes, as we make the most to protect our physical health, we need to ensure that we do not do so at the expenses of our mental health, because let's face it, if we do not ensure decent standards of mental health at this season, we cannot really expect this lockdown to be profitable to us. We cannot expect our broader life to achieve any levels of prosperity unless prosperity starts here in our mind. So in this episode we are going to be looking at the biblical perspective on mental health, and we're going to be looking at not just the practical solutions but permanent solutions to issues in this particular area. And I know that some of you, as maybe you are just stumbling upon this video, you might think, this is going to be Bible bashing, this is going to be, Jesus talk, blah, 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 and, surely there's nothing good for me in here. I would tell you, just hold that thought, okay? Don't let this introduction kind of put you off. In fact, you may be just of someone that have been struggling with issues of mental health for many years, and you've tried all sorts of stuff, some of which were kind of more profitable than others, but really you haven't come to a final and lasting solution. What's the harm in giving this video a try and giving God a try at this particular season? After all, what have we got to lose? So we are going to be looking at these things from God's perspective, from the Bible's perspective, and we're going to discuss together not just practical solutions, practical aids, as we try and make sure that our mental state is as healthy as possible at this season of lockdown, but we're also going to be looking for more permanent solutions. And I would like to start us off, since we're going to be looking at this issue from a biblical perspective, I would like us to start us off with the Bible. And one simple verse that contains some key words that we're going to be exploring in this episode and the next. They're going to be particularly helpful as we try to understand this biblical perspective on mental health and what we need to do in order to achieve high levels of mental health. And it's found in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. It says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." I'm going to read that again, particularly that first half, because it contains some really key words. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So there you have these kind of three key words that are going to guide us in this episode and the next: conformed, transformed, and renewal, the renewal of our mind. And I would like us to kind of start off with the first word, conformed. Do not be conformed to this world. Now, definition of conforming, of being conformed, is to be similar in form, to behave according to a certain standard or pattern. Now, if you would like a more graphic illustration, try and picture yourself back when you were a kid, and maybe you were at the beach and you were there with your parents, and maybe, like I used to do, build sand castles. I remember my father and myself taking a bucket. It normally was in the shape of a castle tower, and just filling it up with moist sand, press it down, and then turn the bucket upside down and gently lift it, leaving that sand stacked up in the shape of a castle tower. Now, in that particular case, the sand, which originally had no form or no shape whatsoever, was conformed to the shape of that bucket, resulting in a similar shape, in fact, in an identical shape. The same example could be applied, say, to Play-Doh. All right, when you play with children and they're playing with Play-Doh, they've got all sorts of different little shapes. They press the dough in, and when they pull out that shape or that mold, there you have it, a little cow, a little hen, or whatever farm animal they're playing with. And if you like a more sophisticated kind of illustration of conformation, of being conformed to a system or to a mentality or to a culture, think back to your teenage years and some of the most ridiculous fashions that you've embraced, that you've conformed yourself to, simply because of the environment that you were surrounded with, or simply because of the types of friends and social groups that you were part of when we're young. Our desire is to, we say that our desire is to be transgressive, but really ultimately is to fit in with our peers. And so there's always an element of conformation, of conforming ourselves, our ways, our mindset, our behaviors, our trends, to whatever it is that is surrounding us. And the Bible here is telling us, do not be conformed to the world. What is the world? Now, we would make a mistake if we thought that the world is the world, planet Earth, as we understand it, because the Bible's definition of the world is something a bit more specific and a bit more sophisticated. Whenever we read in the Bible of the world, it always refers to a system that has rejected God, a system that is in opposition to God, a system that operates in independence from Him, that promotes that independence as well. And as such, the world has got a very specific shape, a very specific form, a very specific narrative, especially here in the West. I'm sure some of the things I'm going to mention next, they will resonate with you, and you'll agree with me. They're particularly central to the type of culture, mentality, and society in which we live in nowadays. It's a narrative according to which there is absolutely no God. We ourselves as human beings, as well as anything else that is of beauty and that is of value, we're just a blip in the universe. We're just the product of a mindless and heartless process that somehow by chance brought us to this particular point. Personally speaking, I think you need more faith in believing that than in believing in a creator. As such, there is no real ultimate and eternal purpose to human life. The next best thing which we are kind of encouraged to aspire to is to simply seek to achieve whatever we want, whatever we desire. Connected to all that, there's the principle, this ideology that there is no ultimate truth, that truth somehow is subjective. There is my truth, there is your truth, and that they're all equally valid, which is an idea. It's a concept that really defies logic, and that even philosophically makes no sense whatsoever. And part in all that mix, there's also the concept that there is no real identity. Each and every one of us just chooses who to be or even what to be. And so this world, whichever corner of the world that you find yourself at, whatever corner of the planet, each culture will have its own worldview. It's going to have its own mindsets and values, and just like we do here in the West. But how do we end up conforming ourselves to the world? We all like to think that we are intelligent people, that we think independently, that we don't just follow the crowd, that we're not like mindless sheep just following the masses. But ultimately, all of us will conform to this narrative that surrounds us, one way or another, because because we are surrounded by this narrative, whether we like it or not, and conformity often happens through continuous, prolonged, persistent exposure to that particular narrative, to that particular shape. It's this constant exposure that little by little pressures us into a shape that surrounds us, into a narrative, into adopting a narrative that surrounds us, to the point in which we just take it for granted. We don't even think about it. We just assume that it's true. And I can speak on this phenomena. Personally, I've often come across individuals that would believe with all their heart, with all their will, with all their resolves, into things that are never really questioned in the first place. I remember when God put a particular estate here in Blackburn on our heart, an estate that for many years has been characterized by crime, addiction, poverty, and what have you. An estate that God really put on our heart to love and to make a difference in. And when we went into that estate for the very first time, my desire was to talk to people and try and find out in which way we could be of help. So I would introduce myself as a church leader, that we were thinking of coming into the area, maybe set up a church, and just try find ways to bless that community and to help them out. And so I would ask them, is there anything that you think this estate needs, anything that we can do to help? And the response, and this really kind of surprised me, the response was always the same, irrespective of who I was talking to, irrespective of gender, age group, nationality. The response was always the same, which was, well, we don't need church here. We don't like church here. If you come here, you'll get vandalized every other day, and you won't last even a couple of months. And to which my follow-up question was always, well, have you had any bad experience of church? What is it that makes you react the way that you are to the idea of any churches coming in wanting to do good? And their response was, well, I've never been to church. So you see that there was a very strong preconception about a reality, in this case church, that was never really the product of personal experience. It was the product of a mindset, of a culture, of whatever, an opinion, a preconception has been passed on, and to which people invariably kind of conform themselves to. But I could also bring you other examples of individuals that, for example, have been exposed to a constant negative and harmful narrative about themselves, and ended up living lives of great dysfunctionality because of the mark that narrative brought about in their lives. Okay, so individuals that for all their lives have been told by people that had influence on their lives, be it their spouse or partner or their parents or their friends, people that they were close to. Individuals that were told that they were worthless, or they were good for nothing, or that they will never amount to anything, or that they were unlovable, or that they were a mistake, and their parents wished they'd never been born. All these words, all this narrative, spoken over and over again on their lives, left them with really, really deep scars that affected their life in terms of their insecurity, in terms of their fear and anxiety and depression, in terms of hopelessness, thinking that life would never be good for them and that they could never really achieve anything, and so they had no sense of achievement whatsoever. Really, really powerful stuff. In fact, the Bible tells us that there is, in the tongue, there is the power of both life and death, and I've often encountered the negative effects of the tongue on a human life. And it is this constant exposure to a certain narrative that kind of begins to create thought patterns in our mind that kind of reinforce themselves. If we're told the same thing over and over again, that reality from being external eventually becomes internal. It becomes a thought pattern that sustains itself and keeps on pumping out that same message by default in our mind. And I've got another example of this. I sometimes walk up, not sometimes, quite often actually, I walk up Darwin Tower, stands atop of a hill, and it kind of stands atop of the valley where Blackburn and Darwin stand. And it's a great spot, you know, for a walk, for some prayer, for just chilling. And when you get on top of the tower and you look out in the opposite direction over the moors, you see this wilderness, really, of hills and valleys and all these public footpaths kind of cutting across. And if you think about it, they're not marked. Okay, they're ancient, but they're not marked. They've been there for centuries and they've never moved. Why? Because people just keep on walking on those same lines. They keep on walking in that same direction, and it's this continuous walking that has actually dug out these paths. And again, you know, that's an example of what happens into our mind whenever we are constantly moving in a certain direction in our mind, you know, towards negativity, towards hopelessness, towards meaninglessness, and stuff like that. Those paths, whereas at first they were very faint, you know, when that narrative was first spoken over us, over time they begin to kind of take shape. They begin to get deeper and deeper, to the point that we can't escape that path anymore. If I were to walk those moors, guess where I would be walking? Not where the grass is thick, but where the path is laid out. And by walking on it, I would reinforce it again. And that's exactly what it means to be stuck in a rut. All right. We can be stuck in a rut mentally, into a rut that is not positive, but that is very, very negative. So who or what determines the shape or narrative of the world that surrounds us? This narrative that the Bible tells us we must not be conformed to. Well, whether we're talking about our a smaller world, okay, our circle of friends, our you know, the scope of our individual lives, or the lives of our communities, or of our nations, or even the world, you know, the realities that have access to its shape, you know, that have the power to shape it, or individuals, or small groups, or organizations, or governments, anyone in a position of influence. Okay, we often talk about influencers. Well, influencers, they're not just individuals. They can be individuals with millions of followers, either on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, you know, on social media more broadly, or on the medium TV. You know, there's not just this type of social influencers, you know, but influencers can take the shape of entire groups, entire lobbies, governments. History as well is a very powerful agent of influence, of shaping kind of the narrative of the world that we live in, culture and so on. But the Bible identifies one reality that kind of supersedes all that. Yes, we've all got all these various different types of influences and influences that determine the shape of the world around us, but there is one reality that kind of supersedes them all, an influencer or of influencers, if you like, that the Bible identifies as Satan. Now, Satan, I know some of you will recall and think, oh, come on, this is too much for me. Hang on a second. Satan isn't a first name. Satan is just a Hebrew word that simply means enemy. In fact, we often talk about Satan, but really technically we should say the Satan, the enemy. You know, the spiritual person that is set against God and mankind itself. Why mankind? Because, like we've seen in previous episodes, mankind's been made in the image of God. It carries something of God. It carries something of the divine, and we are hated by extension because Satan hates God. He hates us, human beings, as human race, because we have been made in the image of God. And the Bible tells us lots of things about this spiritual, invisible, and yet very, very real enemy. It says that he's the ruler of this world. The Bible goes on to explain how we became the ruler of the world. That's because we gave him the rule without even knowing, but that's a completely different topic, and maybe, who knows, we'll come back to it in future episodes, I'm not sure. But yeah, it says that he's the ultimate ruler of the world. He's the ultimate source of influence. He is the one that ultimately writes the narrative and determines the shape of the world. This is why the Bible says, do not be conformed to the world, because he is the main author. It says that the Bible says that he only comes to kill, to steal, and to destroy, that he's been a murderer from the beginning, and that he is the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. So you see, there's that identification with his work. You know, he is the one who is at work in the sons of disobedience. Anyone that would kind of buy into this narrative of living in independence from God. But then he says this, he is the father of lies. Not only it says that he's the father of lies, but that lying is his common tongue, is his mother tongue. The Bible says, Jesus says that the enemy, the devil, Satan, call him whatever you want to call him, he cannot but lie. Whatever he says is a lie, because lying is part of his nature. Lying is the only language that he can speak. So whatever he's going to say is always going to be a lie. Super masterly crafted, but a lie nonetheless. And so this is why the Bible tells us not to be conformed to the world, not to take on that shape, not to embrace its patterns and values and mindsets and worldview. Why? Because it's all inspired and based upon lies. Lies that have been designed by the enemy to keep us away from the source of our life, from the source of our well-being, of all prosperity, of all hope and future and destiny, all the beautiful things that are stored up in a relationship with God. He hates him and he hates us, and he wants to cut us off from him, that we might join him in his rebellion against God. And so he pumps out all these lies that as a pastor, as a church minister, I often see affecting individuals, to do with worthlessness, to do with purposelessness and meaninglessness, to do with hopelessness. You know, individuals that go for years, for the vast majority of their adult life, thinking that they're unlovable by default. And no matter how much you try to explain to them that they are lovable, that they deserve to be happy, that they deserve, you know, to have healthy relationships, that they have a right to aspire to something greater for themselves, no matter how much positive words are pumped into their lives, still the lie is the one that holds them back, that holds them down, that holds them chained into a prison of their own mind. These are lies that have become thought patterns, and these thought patterns, once they're formed in our mind, well, guess what happens? They transform, they turn themselves into dysfunctional life patterns. And very often when I deal with individuals like that, they all share very common traits like insecurity, fear, anxiety, depression, isolation, withdrawal, addiction, self-harm, suicide. And I know that you might be looking at me, and you maybe, if you know me, you might think, well, surely he's never had to struggle with anything like that. But let me stop you right there and tell you no, because I speak from experience. My teenage years, they were the worst. And in secondary school, I ended up in a class full of bullies, and I myself had all sorts of reasons why people would bully me and kind of keep me at arm's length, or mortify me if making fun of me wasn't enough. You know, the fact that I had the most horrible braces, nothing invisible like there now, you know, things with braces that would even come out of my mouth and strap behind my head. I was the shortest of my class. I'm half French, and the relationship between Italians and French people, they're not, it's not that great. So there was a lot of racism there. The fact that I was a Protestant evangelical from an evangelical family in a country of Catholics, you name it. Every day was hell for me going to school. But back in those days, depression wasn't picked up as it is picked up now, and neither was bullyism. Back in those days, you just couldn't talk about it with anyone, because if you did and someone did something about it, it would end up worse for you. So it's really, really awful. I would spend many days riddled with this congenital sadness, which now we understand that we call it as depression, suffering from depression and anxiety, so much so that it had a physical effect on me. I developed ulcers in my stomach at the age of 12 that gave me excruciating pain, and nobody thought it was mentally related. Doctors always thought it was something to do with the way I was digesting food, and so it was misdiagnosed and it was mistreated, and it was like that for a good 4 years. And when I came out of secondary school and I went into high school, my confidence was shattered. I had no aspirations, I had no desire, I had zero. I was just as flat as a carpet. And yeah, I mean, I still remember when my parents were invited. It was like a parents meeting where the head teacher would be discussing the potential of your child, you know, in terms of what school should he aspire to, you know, what high school, what college, what university, what kind of career, you know, kind of a career advice night. And I remember my parents coming home and telling me that my head teacher told them that I couldn't even aspire to become a bin man. All right. So these are all comments. These are all lies. Now I know that they're lies. They have been spoken over me, and that determined my life for the next few years. You know, it took God and it took a number of individuals that spoke a different narrative in my life to help me realize that it was all a lie. But until then, you know, those had become thought patterns that became dysfunctional life patterns altogether. So how do we break out of these patterns? You know, if you're watching and you say in this video, you might be thinking, well, I know this stuff because I'm in it. How do I break out of it? Well, we're going to be talking about this with the remainder of this video, and more specifically as well with the second part of this video next week. In this verse, Romans 12, verse 2, we read the Apostle Paul saying, do not be conformed to the world, but rather, on the other hand, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Now, that tells us that if we want to live a completely different life, okay, one that is not characterized by dysfunctional life patterns, but by great life-giving patterns, we need to make sure that we first achieve renewal of mind. And I know that there are many things, many tools, many treatments out there and stuff like that that kind of can provide some form of benefit toward that. But we're not talking about patching up here our mind. We're not here talking about slightly course correcting our minds. No, we're talking about the renewal of our minds, something completely more radical, something long lasting, something like a final solution to our problem. Now, God's desire is for our life pattern to be transformed from dysfunctional to functional, from something full of darkness to something full of light, from something that kind leads to death, to something that is full of life. But this cannot happen unless we first find renewal for our minds. It says, don't be conformed to the world, but rather be transformed by what? By the renewal of your mind. But how do we experience that renewal? And I'm not talking about a patching up, okay, of our mind. I'm not talking about just an ongoing treatment through medical means. I'm not talking about sitting with a psychologist, once a week for the next foreseeable future. I'm talking about renewal. I'm talking about a radical transformation and radical healing of our mind, where our mind is actually made completely new. How do we achieve that level of long-lasting and permanent even solution with regards to our mental health? Well, in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 11 we come across a very interesting verse that kind of points out to the very, very first step, the most fundamental and foundational reality that we need to put in place in our journey towards that complete renewal. And that verse in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 11 says this: put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Okay, so he's talking about doing something, putting on an armor that protects us from the narrative that is out there. Okay, whether it is a broader narrative that surrounds our world, or whether it is a more specific narrative that has been spoken over us for many, many years. We cannot separate ourselves from, we cannot stop the exposure. We can't do that. We can't be hermits and live under a rock, to get us away from a narrative that will be harmful to us, from realities that will seek us to be conformed to them. We can't do that. But what we can do is to protect ourselves from it. Hence, one of the pieces of this armor goes on to say, take the helmet of salvation. So here the Apostle Paul describes salvation as a reality that once we put on, protect our mind. Look at the picture of a helmet. It's designed to protect our most vulnerable part. And that's a beautiful way of describing salvation as a reality that stands in between our mind and whatever narrative that is out there, whatever lie that is out there, whatever reality that is seeking to take control of our mind. Now, the fight for our life is fought on the battlefield of our mind. Hence the necessity for us to protect our mind, because once our mind's taken over, our whole life will be taken over. Once a lie creeps into our mind and takes hold and becomes a thought pattern, then it will become eventually a life pattern as well, a dysfunctional life pattern. Hence the necessity for us to put on the helmet of salvation. And putting on the helmet of salvation simply means breaking partnership, breaking our agreement with the narrative of lies that has taken over our mind, that we have conformed ourselves to for the past months, years, decades, maybe our whole life. It's about breaking agreement with that and start a new agreement, a new partnership, this time with God through Jesus. Right? We talked about the world as a system that is set against God, that promotes living in independence from Him, living life as we want rather than as He wants. Well, putting on the helmet of salvation means breaking partnership and agreement with that system and starting a new partnership with God, a new agreement with Him through Jesus. That's what it was sent for. And he himself said, I have come to give them life and to give it to the full. He has come to reunite us with our Father and reunite us with his narrative. A narrative of truth that leads to life, that leads to purpose, that leads to value, that leads to all the things that we crave so much for. And in the next video, we're going to be talking about, a number of steps and practical realities that we can put in place towards that new narrative. But it all starts with this first step, putting on the helmet of salvation. It's about acknowledging our partnership with a narrative that is leading us not just away from God, but at times even against God, that has caused us to transgress, that has caused us to disobey him, that has caused us to really break his law, his values, break his heart. It all starts with acknowledging what the Bible identifies as sin, all of our transgressions and disobedience, our agreement to live life without him, to be our own gods, to live life our own way. And so I would like to encourage you today, even as you're watching this video, maybe right now, maybe in the next few days before the next episode, to actually break partnership with the world, to choose today not to be conformed to the world anymore, but to be transformed altogether as God begins to renew your mind, as you give yourself to him, as you choose to move from the camp of the world to his kind, from a kingdom of darkness, if you like, to a kingdom of life, from a kingdom of death and dysfunctionality to a kingdom of life and functionality. And so, if you don't know how to pray, but you would like to begin to see a major breakthrough in your life with regards to your mental health, just pray the following prayer with me. Close your eyes and say, Dear God, I am sorry that I've conformed to this world for the better part of my life. I am sorry that I've lived a life in disobedience. I'm sorry that I have lived a life of independence from you, if not a rebellion altogether. I pray that you forgive me and that you give me a brand new chance. I pray that you transfer me from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of life today, and that you give me too the helmet of salvation to protect my mind from the lies that have been spoken over me, and that I might begin to believe your truth. Please forgive me. I asked it in Jesus' name. Amen. If you've prayed this prayer, you can, believe you me, God's listened, and God will begin to do something wonderful for you. Okay? This is the beginning of a new journey, and you will be able to mark it as a very, very special day for many years to come. And today we've only just looked at kind of the dynamics of mental health from a spiritual perspective, and we talked about the foundation, towards mental health and mental renewal, complete perfect healing. And it all starts with putting on the helmet of salvation. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at the steps that follow from the very simple but very effective steps that we must take, not just at the beginning of our journey, but throughout our life, to ensure that our mind becomes that renewed place that leads us to life, that leads us to prosperity, that leads us to a life of functionality and wholeness and beauty and perfection and blessing that God has destined us all to achieve. Until then, the Lord bless you. If you've got any questions, just leave them here in the comment section or message me privately. It'll be I'll be more than happy to come back to you as soon as possible. God bless you all. Bye bye.